Welcome tonight. Good evening. My name is Maria Takolander, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation and Hachette, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's author event with this lovely man sitting next to me, Rhett Davis, who is here to discuss this novel, Hovering. It's funny, it's thought-provoking, and it's utterly unique, and was reviewed in Readings catalogue today in the Readings magazine. Was actually featured as Book of the Month, which is a really big deal for a debut novel. Yes, indeed. And it was described as, and I quote, a hugely imaginative and brilliantly executed literary debut. So, and I can tell you, having read it, that this book is as good as that review suggests, but also as this absolutely stunning front cover, you've got to be happy with this cover.
It's amazing.
Suggests too. Before we start talking about the book, I'd like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung and Eastern Ma original owners of the lands on which the Geelong Regional Library Corporation services operate, and to pay respects to Wadawurrung and Eastern Ma elders past, present and emerging. The First Nations people are the first storytellers and custodians of knowledge of this land, and we have so much to learn from them when it comes to how to pay due attention to the place we live. Now, that kind of issue, this business of paying attention to where we live, is absolutely germane to Rhett's novel, and we're going to hopefully touch on that later tonight. But let's first meet our author. Rhett Davis is a local, he's one of us, and his short stories have been published in The Big Issue, Meanjin and The Sleeper's Almanac. In 2015, he completed an MFA in creative writing at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Hovering was written as part of a PhD at Deakin University and won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an unpublished manuscript in 2020. And I'm sure there are many more plaudits and prizes to come for this brilliant and beautiful looking book. So Rhett, having introduced you as a writer, I'd like to begin by asking you to share your journey to becoming a writer, because in many respects, the way you've done it, is a kind of dream pathway to success, with the manuscript already winning a major prize and attracting the attention of Hachette, a major publisher. I mean, you didn't spend time on the slush pile like the rest of us. So tell us the secret.
Sure. I'm 46, so it has taken a little while longer than maybe I would have originally liked. But yes, thank you, Maria. That was a lovely intro. As I was saying before, this could be the long story or it could be the sort of medium story, and the long story could probably take the whole session, but we'll keep it sort of in between. I probably have always written since I was quite young. I would say that Lord of the Rings really kicked me off, and I was writing all sorts of swords and sorcery sort of stuff for a long time there. And into my 20s, I was getting more into science fiction and things like that, but I wasn't really doing anything with it. I was keeping it to myself. I didn't study literature. I went and did went on into the sort of the computing world, I suppose, and that's where I worked and continue to work sometimes. And my mother actually, it was in my late 20s, my mother actually, I'd been telling her about all these stories I was writing and how good I was at it and all that kind of stuff. And she said, yep, okay. And we were at that stage in our conversation where she was getting a bit sick of it, I think. And she sort of said, yeah, when am I going to see something though? And it really hit me, like a bit of a lightning bolt at the time. I was, I didn't have an answer for her. I said, oh, soon. And it was not long after that, I was in my late 20s, it was not long after that she actually, she died quite suddenly. And it was really, obviously that's a devastating moment, full stop, but that became a kind of a catalyst, I suppose. I realised at that point, why would I be waiting now? There's no more time to wait. And so in the wake of her going, I spent a couple of years just frantically sort of reading, writing, and doing all I could. Started to submit short stories to places like The Big Issue and got them accepted somehow. And things started to snowball from there a little bit. Went to Vancouver and did the MFA over there. Came back and talked to you about doing a PhD at Deakin and the novel, which we'll talk about a little bit more, obviously. And it was at the end of that PhD I wasn't sure about this thing that I'd written, to be honest with you. I was this book that I'd written as part of it. I was a bit different. Okay. I decided I would submit it to the Victorian Premier's Literary Award competition because I just always had that goal in mind, I suppose. It's always a good thing to have a goal, right? A bit of a deadline. And submitted it, walked away and decided, that's probably it, I think. I'm done. And they called me in November at a conference, and just told me I'd been shortlisted, and that was really where everything kind of changed. It's an award that I think if you get shortlisted for it, that's when the publishers and agents start to talk to you. And so the slush pile becomes, it's just a quick way into it. I think and there's quite a few of those awards out there, I think, that do that. And that's, here we are.
So that was the medium length version of that.
It was a bit long. I know I went a bit long, but yeah.
No, it was very succinct. And I have to say that you may not have felt confident with the result, but when I read it, I thought it was stellar and wasn't surprised at all when it won the Manuscript Prize. But I do think you've hit on a key thing, which is setting yourself those kinds of goals, as something to aspire towards and give yourself a chance of getting there.
Yeah, I think it's all about showing the work, right? And that's the same sort of thing that Mum was talking about, I suppose, too. Yeah. It's about sometimes just having that push to actually put it out in front of you and risk that rejection. And that's what, you're going to get rejected more often than not as a writer, I think. And you have to sort of learn to live with that a little bit, I think. But you can't let it stop you. No. I guess that's the lesson.
No, but no rejection for you here.
Not in this case, no.
But even after you've hit the proverbial jackpot in winning the Manuscript Prize, in getting the book contract with Hachette, the publication process, it doesn't happen overnight, and particularly, I imagine, during 2 years of the plague. Basically, can you speak to us a little bit about the kind of patience, perhaps, that was required and the process of getting this book to the form that we see it in today? Sure.
Well, I won the award in January 2020, so just a couple of months before it all happened. And we had a big sort of party up there. It was all good fun. And then it was really, I signed with Hachette not long after that, but things changed very quickly. And from a publishing point of view, I suppose I was just kind of working through edits. There wasn't an awful lot of editing to do on it. It wasn't too much of the structural sort of changes needed, just sort of line by line stuff and a few extra bits here and there. So it was quite the first year I probably didn't do too much. It was just the first year was just sit. Just sit with it a little bit. And then certainly in the last 6 months in particular, and that's really, the activities happened, I suppose. But yeah, so you're going through the editing process a little bit, and planning out how it's going to go. But yeah, it was pretty good. It was a pretty painless sort of process. I've really enjoyed it. But the pandemic has obviously changed things a lot. It probably would have come out a little bit earlier, possibly, if a pandemic hadn't happened. There was all sorts of things happening to publishing at the time. They were worried about all sorts of things, and debut authors in particular, I think, have really struggled in this time to get any sort of recognition. So obviously they're making sure that the debut authors are going to be okay. So I had to be careful.
And we were saying in the green room, actually, that the timing of this book's publication is quite extraordinary, because the book is, presents a world that's completely unsettled, that's, discombobulating. Things are changing and, at every turn, quite literally. And, look at the world, that we've emerged from these plague years, and we see around us, it's just constant change, feeling constantly unsettled. And I think that's a good segue to discussing this novel now. So Hovering does present us with this, really notable scenario of a literally shifting suburban world where everything from letterboxes to doors to roads are shifting, are changing from one day to the next. And to give you all a sense of things, I'm going to ask Rhett now to read a short extract from the novel so you can get a sense of this very strange scenario that he presents to us. Are you reading your copy, Rhett?
I'll read my copy
Okay,
if you
I've
like,
got a pink tag on mine.
So
but
page
that's fine,
70?
That's fine.
Yeah.
Page 71, please.
All right. Lydia had lived in Fraser her entire life. She didn't think of it as a city. It was larger than that. It was a country filled with cities. The theatres and once palatial bars of Guthrie Street were a city. The winding Almond Boulevard with its protesting palm trees and seaside cafes and kiosks was a city. The river restaurants and the twinkling lights that lined the Avenue Elms were a city. The Japanese district, the Italian village, the Irish pubs, the Indian street, the Greek side, the Turkish thoroughfare, the Sudanese corners, the Chinese lanes. Fraser was a country with cities as foreign to her as Las Vegas or Madrid. She kept to her well-worn paths, Embley, the quiet suburb in which she'd grown up, the sprawling mall on its outskirts, the business park a couple of suburbs away. She occasionally went to lunch with Amy and Jacinta, two of her university friends, and they always met at the same cafe nearby. She never needed to leave, so she didn't. And this is where I should have started, right here. The first shift she noticed was 10 years ago. She was walking on Ormond Street when she saw her neighbour, Aramis Cachola, standing in his front garden. She said hello and he waved back. He pointed to a new letterbox planted incongruously in the middle of his yard. It had been installed carefully. It even had the correct street number on the front. Bloody kids, he said. She shook her head with what she hoped looked like empathy. The next day, the front door of Faye and Louis Montana's house had been moved several metres to the left. It now opened on their bedroom. Faye stood at the door in a Melinda Banksia Festival 2000-something shirt, looking out at the street in some confusion. Lydia waved and shrugged. Faye, who hadn't acknowledged Lydia's presence in the 3 years the Montanas had lived there, glared at her as if she might be responsible. These minor incidents continued. Nature strips became tiny swimming pools. Formerly white houses were painted a lurid red overnight. Telephone and internet cables crossed streets in baffling configurations. Reports came in from all over the city. Fences became hedges, tiled roofs became corrugated iron. Footpaths became concrete when they had been asphalt, and asphalt when they had been concrete. It was mostly laughed off. People tried to catch the culprits on their phone cameras, but they never could. Whoever was changing things didn't want to get caught. Rumours of child pranksters gave way to rogue teams of construction workers prowling the streets as part of a sick game to frighten the populace. Lydia was alarmed by the changes but dealt with them like everyone else. One morning, 5 years ago, something felt different. She felt it at her feet, a discontented hum. She left for work, drove a few kilometres, then turned left. The traffic was heavy. A man in a van at a set of stoplights looked around as if he didn't know where he was. She drove for a few hundred metres, then turned right. A red sedan passed her, its driver looking flustered. Then a blue ute passed, its fluorescent vested occupants arguing. Only then did she realise she was in the middle of an industrial zone she didn't recognise. There was an oil refinery. She didn't even know Fraser had an oil refinery. She stopped and got out. Lines of cars were parked beside her, their occupants standing by their vehicles, staring at the refinery. She hadn't missed a single turn. She was sure of it. So where was she?
Terrific. Oh, yes, let's... good to have a sister in the audience to instigate the applause, Rhett.
Thanks, Rod.
That's well done.
Good on you.
And things just get worse with this scenario, of the shifting city, and things become extraordinarily chaotic, and there are all kinds of theories being thrown around as to how this is happening and why this is happening. But why is it happening, in the sense that what gave you the inspiration for this morphing city? What was the spark for that idea? I mean, I think it had something to do... I've known Rhett for quite a long time, but so I'm actually having to pretend I don't know the answers to these questions. But I won't in this instance, because I think it had something to do with a painting.
Yeah,
Am I right?
Well, first of all, I'm not telling you. You've been asking this for a long time, and I'm not telling you why it's doing this. There are lots of reasons, but yes, look, there's a few things to say. I want to leave the actual reasons of why the city's doing that to the readers a little bit. It's a bit of an interpretation thing. There to me is quite a few things underlying that thematically that are to do with feeling unsettled at home, feeling unsettled in a colonised city, those sort of things. But those are all, for me, things that readers might have to interpret. One of it's come from an area, from where it's come from my point of view, is feeling... I've lived for about 10 years away from Geelong and Melbourne, overseas at various times, and I've always come back here, but every time I sort of go away and come back, there's a sort of a strange sort of sense of not quite connecting to the place that you're from, the place that you call home, in quite the same way. It's just always a little bit different. It's always this sort of uncanny feeling of like, you know all the streets, but there's something a little bit different there. And the last time I came back, I was we were in Vancouver for a few years, and we're flying home over Melbourne. And I just had this feeling of this land lying out before me, and realising this is home, but it still feels quite removed. And I wanted to write about that feeling, and that's why when I sort of talked to you about it in the start, I was sort of wrestling with that a little bit. Wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it, because every time I write about Geelong or Melbourne, I suck at it, basically. I'm not very good at literal interpretations. As soon as I try to write about Miracle Street, it just doesn't work for some reason. And I saw a painting, finally getting to the painting. We got there. There's a painting on the wall at Deakin University in the Chancellery there. It's called Geelong Capriccio, if Geelong was settled instead of Melbourne. And it's by a painter called Jan Senbergs. And it's a big aerial painting of Port Phillip Bay, where Melbourne's at the top, obviously, and Geelong's in the west. And Melbourne is a series of fields, and Geelong is this big metropolis going all the way down the Bellarine Peninsula and over to Point Nepean. There's a bridge from Point Lonsdale to Point Nepean. We all know what that is, don't we? And it just struck me at that moment that I could write about it slightly in a very uncanny way myself. I could take something and not necessarily write about Geelong and Melbourne in a very direct sense, but I could do this sort of slightly strange take on it. And the shifting is possibly another thing altogether, but that's where it really started.
Oh, that's such a terrific story. I mean, I've heard it 10 times, but every time I love it. And, if only I could look at a picture and get such a great idea for a novel, I'd be thrilled.
It's a bit of poetic license, I have to say, but yeah, it was pretty much that. It was pretty much that.
It's really fantastic. And there are so many place names in the novel that you read as someone resident in Geelong that, you kind of get the joke that's going on here. And so there are these place names which are slightly skew-if, but they certainly give the game away that the novel's origins are in Geelong. So there's Johnston Park, unreconstructed as a name.
It's right there, yep.
Manifold Street.
Yes. Ormond
Street. Gerringap Beach.
It's Jerringhap.
Is it?
We all know it's Jerringhap.
Helen Garner, I don't know how.
Who says it's Jerringhap?
We need a vote.
It's Jerringhap, thank you.
Jerringhap, okay.
Maria.
Well, I wasn't born and bred here.
No, I know.
So,
it's a local thing. It's a local thing.
All right. Okay, I'm terribly embarrassed. Yeah. Anyway, so that's a good, fun game, I think, for a local reader. But so anyway, so we'll introduce one of the characters, Alice, who, like you, I suppose, has spent a lot of time overseas, and she returns home to this shifting environment of her former home city. And I think it's fair to say that she has a love-hate relationship with Geelong, but also more broadly with Australia. So she feels like Fraser is a, quote, nothing place, in as much as it has nothing of the glamour of worldly cities like New York or Paris. She even describes it as a shithole. A place...
Just to be clear, this is not Geelong we're talking about. This is a fictional city in a fictional book, right? Yeah.
Of course. A place, this is a place where all that seems to matter to people is building and renovating homes in poorly planned and endlessly sprawling housing estates, where people are in denial of their ghastly colonial heritage and where coal is celebrated on a billboard. So look, I imagine, I can hear the laughter. I can hear that a lot of people...
I'm getting a bit nervous at this point.
In this room relate to this kind of ambivalent feeling about Australia. So, in the one sense, we have this sense of dissatisfaction about the place where we live, and yet on the other, it's also our home. So we also have an attachment. And I think what this novel does, which is incredibly brave, is to present love and hatred when it comes to a home as not irreconcilable, that maybe in fact they can coexist. So, you might have your Andrew Bolts of the world who would suggest that if you're critical of your home country, you're somehow a traitor, you're committing an act of treason, and that cannot coexist for the Andrew Bolts of the world with love of country or patriotism. But for your novel, and particularly through the character of Alice, we see that, being critical of her home but loving her home do coexist. Do you feel something of that yourself?
Yeah, I do. I think we talked about it a bit before too. I think it's about wanting something better, wanting things to be better in certain ways, and that's where a lot of that kind of the dislike of the place can be from. Look, I mean, I've often felt quite uncomfortable in my hometown or my home region, really, for lots of reasons. But I do always come back to it, and it is because it's very, it's just in there, I suppose. And to me, that is a case of, and I think there are a few things you could say about the book in that way that I very rarely want to say this is the truth in a book like this. I think that the disliking of where you live, but the loving of where you live at the same time is absolutely it can coexist, I suppose, in the same way that other themes sort of coexist. It's a tension that I'm trying to explore a little bit without actually saying, "No, this place sucks," because it doesn't.
Yeah.
There's lots of good things about it, it's something that I've kind of wrestled with, and it was really something that I wanted to kind of. That's one of the feelings I was trying to work through as writing this novel. What do I feel about here? What do I feel about effectively really Wadawurrung sort of country, and this sort of land from here to Torquay, and this is really where I kind of see myself coming from. It's trying to wrestle with that kind of strange tension, I suppose.
Yeah, and you suggest that, well, the novel suggests that, we can't live here innocently. We can't live here without tension, and if we do, it's because we've got our heads in the sand. So, I mean, I think the novel on that level is wrestling with some really difficult questions when it comes to the topic of home.
And I think Alice in particular is very. She's a very driven and strong-willed version of that. I think she clearly is very. She expresses it quite clearly. The real distrust she has of a lot of the country generally. I think, and that was a way of exploring that to me without being too direct, I guess.
Yes. And one of the ways that Alice explores these ambivalent feelings about home is through her art. I don't want to say too much about this business, but Or do you want to?
Well, but yeah, I mean, you can read some of it's already in some of the reviews anyway, so it's fine.
Yeah.
Look, Alice has an artistic soul, I suppose, is the probably, and she has pursued that in her way.
But she's not doing landscapes, let's make that clear.
No,
I mean, she's engaging.
She's real,
Yeah.
very physical sort of
Yeah.
artwork, sort of sculpture and installations and things like that.
Yeah.
But I've forgotten the question. Do we have
So have I. No, you know, the ways in which Alice explores the difficulty of being at home here
Yes.
through her art.
Yes. Yeah, look, it's a tough one to talk too much about, only because of the, I don't want to give too much away.
Well, let's move on.
No. There's,
That was a
I think
successful
what I would say
question.
is that no, it's a very good question. It's a tough one. Alice is, I think, we sort of see her when she's in her late 30s, and she's sort of mellowing a little bit, but she's been a very angry person, I think, and has expressed that through her art quite sort of viscerally, I think, and that's something that she's having to come back home after sort of being away for quite a long time, and is really at the beginning of the novel anyway, really wrestling with that as you know, and maybe she has sort of mellowed a little bit, but that's a very vague answer.
No, that's all right. We'll move on. We'll move on. If a question doesn't work for you, Rhett, I'm happy. I've got others. We'll just keep going. So we've got three characters who are in this town of Fraser, and we've covered Alice to some degree. She must remain enigmatic until you've read the novel. But there's also Alice's sister Lydia, who's never left Fraser. She's still living in the family home, and that's a place to which the prodigal sister Alice returns. So tell us about Lydia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, she's pretty much the opposite to Alice, I think, in many ways, and she's been there the whole time. They haven't spoken for the last decade. I think that's where the central sort of I guess relationship tension really happens in the novel, is this sort of Alice sort of turning up on her doorstep after not having spoken to Lydia for 10 years. But Lydia's a lot more, she's sort of successful in her own right, but she's just stayed in place. And possibly is struggling a little bit with some stuff. Her son George, who we'll get to, I guess, is also there. It's to me that, as I say, it's the central tension in that novel between those two, and it was really about a way of, for me, exploring moving and staying. Again, that idea of you know, what is it to be sort of settled and comfortable in a place, and what's wrong with that exactly? You know, nothing. Whereas Alice would come in and sort of say, you know, get going, move somewhere, do something. Lydia's just, why? I'm happy here. So there's a little bit of that kind of playing with that sort of tension, I suppose, that I was working with Lydia. She is a little lost, though, I have to say, and she loses herself probably a little bit in digital media and whatever that might be, video games, or yep. She's a gamer.
What about her job?
Her job, yes, her job is what is she? She's a trends innovator, which I couldn't tell you what that is. I don't know. It's something to do with marketing. She invents trends, I think, is what she does. She analyses data and really extrapolates trends and does this sort of stuff for a very shadowy kind of organisation, I suppose. But yeah, she's quite good at it. She's very good. She's got a sort of a very analytical mind, so she's quite successful at it in her own way. But she's just sort of struggling to kind of really find maybe life in all of that. Yes,
and it does strike me that while she has stayed in Fraser, she has stayed at home, she's not terribly engaged with that place, because to me she spends so much time escaping to the digital realm. And that leads me on to Lydia's son, George, who's the third character. Now, he's taken a vow of silence so as not to add any more noise to the discombobulating noise of the world, and he communicates via text. He also spends a lot of time in digital worlds. He even meditates in a virtual forest. So, I mean, he's my favourite character in the book, in part because of his unusual way of communicating. To make a character mute and then to address the challenge of, okay, but how are we going to hear his voice, I think is genius, because it provided these kinds of innovative solutions that we see in the novel. Did you want to say something about George before I ask my question?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think I was a little bit sort of careful about that with some of that, but as in the muteness of him, he takes that choice really because he's struggling with his own sort of noise, as you said. But in some ways, he's probably the calmest of the three of them, and probably the most settled in a way. But he's got his own sort of issues. He's still a young guy, and kind of he needs a little bit of help to sort of understand what to do in the world a bit, I think.
Yes, he has that vulnerability. But through Lydia and George, you set up a relationship, maybe even a tension, between the digital world and the real world, because Lydia and George are so often immersed in these, digital realms, as a lot of us are nowadays. And then outside in the world that they're neglecting, you have this, shifting, chaotic terrain. And I just wondered to what extent that was a deliberate thing for you to, set those two things against each other. Is there a causal link there, perhaps? Is that one of the avenues we might explore?
That is an avenue you may certainly explore.
Thank
Yes.
you. All right.
No, I mean, I don't. The thing is, I don't have an answer for those things. So that is only in the sense that, yes, that is absolutely a possibility. That for me, a lot of the shifting, the idea of this shifting city was very much inspired by the nature of the digital world that we live in, that is really part of our actual life in ways that we couldn't imagine 15 years ago, right? It's infused with the physical world now, and it's the only thing there's many things that are wrong with that, but it's so unstable in so many ways, and so fast-paced and dizzying. And to me, in some ways, the city of Fraser is actually reflecting that a little bit, for sure. But it's not necessarily a causal link, but it's maybe a vaguely metaphoric one, but yes. And I really did want to. I wanted the novel to really. I just couldn't see how I wouldn't put digital culture in there. I mean, it's everywhere, and I work in a technology sort of area as well, and that to me it's inseparable from life at the moment, and I really wanted to grapple with it as to what it was what that meant, because it can feel quite overwhelming yourself, right, at the moment with all that stuff. So I really wanted to try and have these people kind of really grappling with that a little bit.
Yeah, and as a result, the reader also grapples with that.
A little bit,
and there's, I mean, you set so many ideas into play, and one of them is, for instance, that there is the possibility that because these characters are immersed in playing games or communicating on online forums, that anthropogenic climate change is fallen by the wayside as a matter of urgent attention. The awful history of colonialism isn't being addressed because, hey, there's all this distraction available online. Was that something in the foreground of your thinking when you were writing?
Yeah, it was. I think to me, though, some of the colonisation sort of stuff is actually almost critical to the whole thing
Yeah.
in some ways too. So and the big wound I think that we as a country have underlies the whole thing. It's almost probably the biggest thing I think that's in there. Although I'm not obviously an expert in that area, but it really does drive a lot of that. Man, I've forgotten the last bit of your question again.
Oh, so have I. Don't worry about it. But look, I actually have to move in. I'm watching the time. I've got one last question, and then I'm actually going to throw to you as the audience to give Rhett a hard time.
Please
but
do.
this question does follow on very nicely from the last one. I hope you will agree that I have crafted this quite well.
Sure
you have you have these characters immersed in these digital environments, as I said, and of course, as a writer, that gives you the opportunity then to play around with representing people interacting in those digital environments. And I said that one of the notable things about this novel is the shifting world that we find ourselves in. Well, another really notable thing about it is its formal innovativeness and experimentation. So, there are sections of traditional narrative, but there are also essays by art critics, there are text messages, property listings, tables, all of these different ways of presenting information that, we engage with on a daily basis as digital beings, that we're constantly ourselves in these spaces that we don't see represented in traditional novels, but that Rhett, brings to the fore here for us. And it's really just such an exciting way to read a novel, to read it through all of these different forms. It's really terrific. But together, with the shifting world and the shifting narrative, you almost get this, seismic instability being conveyed. Everything is on uncertain ground. Was it fun to write those sections though?
Oh, so much fun to write those sections. It's never fun to write much else, but it's those sections were a blast because you can just sort of remove yourself from what you're writing and have a little segment about a cockatoo or something. You can just really remove yourself in ways to sort of, and it is about providing a bit of, colour to the world that you're writing about. One of the big things there, I suppose, is when I started writing about it in the start of the PhD, I was looking at kind of different forms of ways of putting a novel out there. So I was looking at interactive fiction and ways of putting electronic fiction out there and all this sort of stuff. And I'm sure that would have made publishers kind of like run quickly, but maybe not. But as I was going, I was getting quite annoyed with a lot of the digital world. I was getting quite frustrated. It was, early days of Trump and so forth, and I was getting very frustrated by a lot of that stuff, as I suppose we all were. I was like, why shouldn't the novel just have that in there? Instead of me trying to sort of make it fit this digital world, why can't I fit it into the novel? And so that's where it sort of started to come from, and I started to go onto The Guardian and look at comment sections and describe what I was kind of seeing, and then I did that a few times, and that seemed to work. So I decided to fictionalise things, and then it got a bit weird and fun, and I enjoyed it a lot. So that side of it was actually a lot of fun. And the only other thing I'd say is, are we going for time? Okay. I know that it starts early. About the third chapter, fourth chapter, you start to get hit with a few of these things. It's okay. Don't worry about it. And I'm looking at Dad right now, and Dad knows what's coming. Dad read it a few months ago, and he very, very kindly read it, and he got to this, I think it was the third or fourth chapter possibly, where there's this pseudocode that kind of is in there, and there's characters messaging through this pseudocode, but it gets a little bit, it can be confusing. It's a bit confronting. It's a bit of a gauntlet to run, I guess. And he called up my sister, and still didn't call up me, but that's okay. Brooke could probably explain it better than Dad, but better than me. Sorry, Dad couldn't explain it, obviously. And he just sort of said, "What do I do with this? How am I supposed to read it?" And I'm not sure how Brooke answered. I'm sure it was a good answer, but I guess what I would say to anyone who's sort of thinking that is that it's about kind of finding, there's a lot of noise in there, in some of these spots, but don't worry too much about it. Try and find the human in there. There's a human in there always, trying to communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. But the style for me resonates so much with how I read online. You know that there, you know, there's the articles, you click over there. There's a table. There's a whole bunch of inane, often bloody irritating comments. You know, from randoms in the discussion section, and you know, so it has the vibrancy and the dynamism of how we read in an online environment, and yet, as you say, it's the whole time foregrounding these characters. These are just different ways of telling the story of these three wonderful characters. Another thing, though, that this does, you know, having these different forms of narration in the novel, is it calls attention to the novel as a work of art. You know, so it's not just a window into another world. You know, we're forced to pay attention to the page, to what you've done on the page. You know, that this novel is a work of literature. It's a work of art. Now, art plays a very significant role in the novel, but you have indicated you don't want to discuss that because, I mean,
I just don't think I'm very good at it.
No, but you know, but also, you know, the enigma of the novel is bound up with the art that Alice produces. So, you know, I appreciate that we don't want to diminish that in any way. But what do you see as the role of this novel as a work of art?
Wow.
Thinking about what art does in the novel, I mean...
Mine just goes blank. Amazing question.
But, you know, that art is so important in the novel, you know, that it's not... Art isn't just something irrelevant or useless in the novel. It can do things.
It's an amazing question. I'll just extend what I kind of said before a little bit and just sort of say, I think for me, I want the novel to resist a little bit. And that's, I think, great art. I'm not saying that's great art. Art resists a lot of the time. It does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is resists, and or maybe shine the light on things that aren't really working the way they should. I'm not necessarily saying in there that I should think we should resist digital culture at all. I think it's infused with what we do, and that's okay. It's to some extent, but we've also got to be aware of what it's doing. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. But I really feel in the last sort of decade or so we've gone off on a pretty weird tangent, and I think I know why. You know, I think there's one reason, and it's the way we're kind of going all over the place online. That's not to say it's wrong, because it's opened up a lot of opportunities and a lot of good stuff has happened. But to me, I just wanted the novel to be a bit more of a... I like analogue things too, you know? I like a book.
Yeah.
And that's maybe wrong, I don't know. But I like them. I think they're great. That's an answer.
Too.
There you go.
And I particularly like this book too.
Thank you.
And I think, you know, seeing the ways that we communicate online, which have become second nature to so many of us, when we see them on a page in this analogue format, they're defamiliarised so that we can look at it again and say, hey, that's a bit wacky, you know, like in a nice way. You know?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly.
And, you know, that's part of the power of the novel in terms of its formal innovations for me, but it is just such a deep work of art, Rhett, and I congratulate you on that. And I hope you've been thinking of your questions, because I warned you that was the last question, and I was going to ask you to give Rhett
I
your
will
thoughts.
make up my own questions.
There is a microphone available, so if you wave your hand around, you will be seen. Here we have a question. Oh, look at this. Interactivity, Rhett.
This is fantastic.
That's a stretch, thank you. Congratulations on that, and the analogy on analogue and having something textural in your hand to look at rather than a screen that's all over the place. But having said that, with your success, do you get the audio book?
That's a very good question.
Thank you.
That is still something to be discussed. I don't know yet. It's a difficult one because it's we have to work out how to do it. And if you've looked at the novel, there's a lot of normal prose sections, but there's a lot of stuff that's going to be difficult to actually act, if that makes sense, or to add a voice to. So, yes, but it's going to be tricky.
Yeah, that would be really tough, actually.
Yeah,
to translate into
and we're
an
sort of
audiobook.
thinking about different ways people have done those kind of things with different actors and things like that before, but it's a tricky one, for sure.
Super question. I know Mark was over there with a question.
Oh, thank you. I actually got a couple of questions, but when you embed your story, your narrative in an environment that you are really familiar with, and that people in this room would be familiar with because we live in on Wadawurrung land, how do you not fall into the trap or how do you make that accessible then to people who have no knowledge of this area and of all of those things that you have embedded in the narrative?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, firstly, I do it by not calling it what it is. I think there's I would just sort of say I tried not to actually be too driven by what's here specifically. I very much am disguising a lot of it in a different. It's a different name of it. A city. It's not an actual city that exists. And I suppose I would also be looking at more universal themes that I'm trying to go for, rather than necessarily things that are just impacting Geelong and the Surf Coast. To me, when I was talking about kind of struggling to write about Mirabel Street or something like that, that is kind of to do with that a little bit too. I need to kind of take a little bit of a step back and change the view myself a little bit to be able to really write about here. I think it's more about trying to attain that kind of universal feeling as well, and not necessarily focusing on, I don't know, the ships down in the bay there, not being too held up on local sort of issues, but lifting out. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I'll have to think about it. I didn't really. I know.
Did you have another question, Mark, as well? Question mark. That was good, wasn't it?
It was good. Yeah.
This one is about winning the Unpublished Manuscript Award. And obviously that changes everything. And I want to hear a little bit about the process of what happened after that, because most authors, you have to pitch, and you have to be ready to pitch. Did that take that kind of out of your hands? And obviously it makes the process easier, but I'd be really interested in how you would have pitched this manuscript if you had not won the award. Yeah,
really good question again. I think it would have been hard, actually. I don't know how it would have gone at all. It would have been a difficult one. The award, as I said before, the shortlisting really is within a day or two of that, it was emails from publishers and agents pretty quickly. And that happens with all people who are shortlisted for that award, I think, in particular. And so it is a fast track to talking, at least. It may not actually get you the contract, obviously, but it certainly gets you having the discussions. I don't know how I would have pitched it. It would have been very difficult. It's a fun but unusual sort of a book to pitch to a publisher, I would say. They might have looked at some of the typesetting and went, "Ooh, that might be challenging for us." I don't know. But I was also, from a personal point of view, I was pretty close to not continuing after this. After I'd finished it, I was pretty demoralised, really, to be honest with you, at that stage in my career. And
which stage?
Before I submitted this to the PhD, I submitted to the BPLAs, but I thought that was, I think it's done. I don't want to do anything with it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was that serious. It was certainly been trying for a while, and I'd felt like I'd probably had tried for long enough. That's an admission for you, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm shocked.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh no, but and that's what these awards can do, right? They can really. But so to answer your question, in a long way of speaking, that was whether I'd even get to the pitch point would have been difficult. I think I'm not sure.
I'm speechless.
Maybe you would have told me to go do something with it. I don't know.
I totally would have.
I was on the fence. I was on the fence.
Would not have let you rest on that manuscript, let me tell you. Do we have another question? I reckon, yeah, there's two here.
Congratulations on an amazing
I think
there's a microphone
Matthew, you're getting a mic. There you go.
Congratulations on an amazing book. And one of the things I really like about it is it's open to so many different interpretations. So it's personal for people. But one question I'd like you to answer is, why is it called hovering exactly?
No, I'm not answering that, Matt. Why is it called hovering exactly? I had the title in mind for a long time. It's a sort of an alchemical thing that I couldn't really explain exactly how I came about it. I took a photograph. Interesting segue. I took a photograph pretty much close to the start of writing it, the first year or so, and I hadn't quite worked out what was happening with it. And I was at the Yuyangs and looking out over. It was a very clear day, and you could see all the way to Melbourne, but there was a haze in between all those plains and the skyline. And I took a photograph there, and I looked at it later on, and it is very much a photograph where you'd certainly see it if you're out there a bit in the right sort of conditions, where the skyline is floating above the plains, those really long plains out there, along Tarneet and so forth. And that kind of hit me a little bit at the time, and that was where I mean, who knows where these things come from, but that is as close as an answer as I can give you. I think it probably came from somewhere like that. Yeah, that was possibly the starting point. Does that sort of get there? I think it gets there, yeah.
And I believe we have another question here at the front.
Getting all my family members and friends to ask questions now. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for such a lovely chat, even though I knew all the answers. It is a really thought-provoking book, but it's also a really funny book. How important is humour to you in your writing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brooke. That's a good question. I think for me, comedy and drama go together. I kind of can't write serious fiction without some kind of level of comedy in there. It just doesn't feel right. It feels very false, I suppose. So I think it's, and all the writers that I love. I mean, I think someone like, Helen Garner is someone who I admire greatly. And she's known as a very beautiful writer, serious writer, but she's hilarious. She's so funny. And to me, that just goes hand in hand with good writing. So that's my answer.
And he's sticking with it.
Yep.
Actually, we were also saying in the green room, in terms of the timing of this novel's release, yes, it resonates, with this deeply unstable world that we live in, but it also gives you a bloody good laugh that you really need after, 2 years of living with COVID. It is a hilarious book, and I think one of the areas in which you really have a great time and your reader has a great time is when you are simulating the kind of conversations that happen in online forums, particularly with the young character George and his friends. Or I don't suppose you have a quick extract available to read on that, do you?
On
just that kind of interaction, that really comic kind of interaction that we see in those online forums. But if you don't sweat it, because you can take my word for it, it's really funny. Are there any other questions
Let me think.
for Rhett? No, they've gone all shy. We're just committed to watching you flick through this book. Absolutely, you can. There's a microphone just on its
wait
way.
on the microphone. Thanks, Dad.
I promised my partner that I wouldn't ask a question, but I have been included already, so I think I have the authority to continue. I just wanted to ask a question that I know he knows the answers to, so that he doesn't seem so indefinite with a question. There's some dispute about Geringhap versus Jeringhap, but in this question there is one definitive answer. Where does the word Fraser derive from, Rhett?
Okay. Well, that's yeah. Someone else want to answer it?
Hello, this is your third cousin.
Oh, hello. This is amazing. This is a family reunion. How lovely.
Is your mother's maiden name? Grandmother's
There you
maiden
go.
name.
That's you got it.
Sorry,
exactly.
I'm the old
Exactly.
generation.
Yes, it's Fraser is my father's mother's maiden name, and it's lovely to see you. Thank you. Yeah, the naming of it's interesting. I mean, I think even what Mark was talking about before, I was conscious that naming of towns is a bit of an issue here. I mean, we've got Melbourne, which is named after a British lord. Geelong's a bit, obviously from a First Nations name, but I was conscious of being a bit of being careful with that a little bit. But in the end, I wanted to name it after my grandmother, so I did.
A writer's prerogative.
In the end, yeah.
Did you end up finding anything, or is it in the two?
I mean,
basket?
I've got these things that, do you ever read something like that?
Yeah, no, I wasn't after that, Rhett, so don't worry about it.
I don't know. I don't know.
The online forums are really funny, the exchanges that George has with some of his... But honestly, we've run out of time, so stop looking. Well, having said we've run out of time, if there is someone with a burning question, I'm sure we can fit that in. No? No burning questions. That's all right.
That's all right.
good.
Is that where he got his PhD?
Yes, he did.
So does he get the photo up on the wall?
For the novel, for having a novel published.
I actually, I'd like to know that myself. I don't know. Is the Vice-Chancellor here?
We should have invited him. Yeah, we should have. Yeah, we'll get on to that.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, we'll get on to that. But look, that's probably all we have time for tonight. We have the Bookbird over there in the corner selling copies of this fabulous book.
Thank you, Bookbird.
And Rhett will be sitting over there ready to give you his autograph.
Apologies in advance for getting everyone's name wrong. I will.
And Hovering is also available to borrow through the Geelong Regional Library Service. So thank you, everyone, for coming along tonight to help celebrate the publication of Rhett's superb debut novel. And please join me in thanking Rhett, but also the library staff and Hachette for making this event possible tonight.
Thank you.